Good enough. Microphone. Holy moly. Okay. All right. Woo. Just check that my audio is working here. Check, check, check. All right, something's working. Okay. Oh, happy day. I've had a number of panicked emails. Hello, is there a link to join today's lecture via live stream? Yes, I'm just late. Back off. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. It's been like from the moment I woke up. I have an exam in SOC 100. And so I think I had 6 emails being like, my cat died. My leg's broken. My cat's leg's broken. Or something. And I'm like, yeah, whatever. I don't care. Do you need your cat to write the exam? My cat knows the material better than I do. Or something. I don't know. It's just chaos as I spent the first like 2 hours of my day answering emails. Okay. So everything is chaos. And then I never stop at Starbucks, but I've skipped breakfast today. So I'm like, I'm just going to pick up a drink and some food at Starbucks. And there was no lineup, but the one person in front of me must have ordered like the most complicated 6 drinks in the world because I was there for like 15 minutes. And I'm like, And I ordered mine, like I ordered it on the road, right? At a red light. I'm like, okay, I'm going to pre-order so it's ready when I get there. It's going to be amazing, super smart. And it's like, oh, you bastard. Anyway, I was not a happy camper. Friday. It's Friday. Okay, I have not started marking your exams at all, by the way. I'm going to get to that at some point, I promise, maybe. I'll try to get it done as quick as I can. So we're going to jump into some new content here. I've just keep an eye on the folder for the lectures because I have basically taken everything out of it. And I'm just going to put things in as I go. If I forget, I apologize. Please do let me know. Oh, a question slide. Oh man, I even forgot to put the Slido. Here's the Slido. Because I just, like, honestly, I'm going through everything. I'm redoing everything. I'm fixing things. I'm going to take out a bunch of content because we fell behind at the beginning of the class, and I want to kind of get back on track. Because these last few topics I think are really, really interesting, and I want to kind of make them all fit in somehow. So, I mean, I did this very smart thing as I went through yesterday in this unit on sex and intimacy. I'm like, I'm going to start deleting things, delete. I moved some things around, and I'm like, wait, I just read this thing yesterday. That's really germane. So then I went and I added about 10 more slides back in. So I took out 3 slides and I added in 10. So I cut content and then added a whole bunch. So I'm really sorry because I'm just, I have impulsivity and self-control problems. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. Okay, I started my day yesterday as I do, usually just scrolling on X/Twitter, and I ran across this. Now, I mean, for weird reasons, my Twitter feed is dominated by a bunch of social scientists, which I think you can imagine why that makes sense. And someone had posted these 2 things together, and I thought it was an interesting place for me to kind of start with this sort of idea, or this debate on kind of sex and intimacy. And I know either of these things necessarily, straight up have to do with sex and intimacy, but someone had juxtaposed these 2 things, right? And this is from Jonathan Haidt, which we're going to hopefully talk about later in the course in great detail if I'm able to make it through his book and get it synthesized in time to fit it into the course. The book's out in 8 days. So in 8 days, I gotta have your exams marked by 8 days so I can fit in Jonathan. But they juxtapose this, right? And so it's kind of an interesting one because it has to do a little bit with sexuality, right? With obviously one of the outcomes of sexuality, which is children. And just kind of a commentary on, on our society, where, or our society and European ones, right? That, where is it? Atheistic societies have only emerged in Europe in the last few decades, right? So places like the Czech Republic, France, England, and Canada increasingly is sort of atheistic or nunnish. They're the least efficient societies ever known at turning resources, of which they have a lot, into offspring, of which they have few. Right? And again, this goes to one of the purposes of sex and sexuality, right? Which is obviously the fostering of another generation. And I know we're now at a point where we're, 60 years-ish on from the invention of the birth control pill. And so in a lot of ways, those two things have become deeply, deeply separated. And whoever it was, and I can't even remember who it was, I just found the juxtaposition interesting. Juxtaposed it from this quote from Seth Rogen, which I think is really interesting too. I hate Seth Rogen, by the way. I've never watched a single one of his movies. And I remember him being on The Daily Show back in the day and saying that he thought education was a complete waste of time. No one should even bother going to high school. College and university were a complete scam. He didn't really, I think he maybe graduated from high school, though definitely didn't go to college. And he's like, yeah, I'm doing amazing. And I'm like, yeah, you're the exception, not the rule, moron. Like your life path of, become a famous actor, famous for what? I don't know. Terrible movies that no one should ever watch. Probably not a great life plan for the average person. So I hate Seth Rogen to begin with. But I thought this quote was wild. It's just like, it struck me so much. Talking about him, and I presume this woman who is his partner. I don't know who she is, and I don't care. But this quote, like, we're fucking psyched all the time. We're laying in bed on Saturday morning, smoking weed, watching movies naked. If we had kids, we could not be fucking doing this. And I'm like, what a wild statement. To me, it's just a wild statement. Like, it's definitely true. Yes, you would not be, maybe you could be. You probably should have your kids taken away if you're doing that. But, obviously, yeah, that's true. And yet it's kind of weird that this has become a life goal. And as we'll see, right, this is like individuality on steroids, right? This is, this is what Twenge was talking about in that first part of the course, with this increase in individuality generation after generation, kind of on, like absolutely on steroids. Because it's like, and again, I don't want to be moralistic about it. It just strikes me as a weird way. And just, keep in mind, I'm a complete dinosaur at this point. Right, I'm end of Gen X, beginning of the millennials. A whole different kind of social world I come out of compared to Gen Z and kind of younger millennials. And so it strikes me as very odd, this sort of hyper individuality. It never has quite made sense to me. But I'm also a little bit of an anachronism because let's just say I was reading like Shakespeare in the 6th grade because I thought it was fun. And I'm a little bit bizarre. I'm a bit of an anachronism. Yeah, Mia, would you like to question my life goals? Is that what you're wanting to question? I can totally explain it to you.
Why does this have to do with hyper-individuality?
Okay, that's an interesting question. Basically, they're completely focused on themselves, right? Like, in a sense, having children is a sort of, how shall we say, you can't be entirely focused on yourself when you have children because they have needs, they want things. They wake you up at 6 a.m, like my son did today, by jumping on you and stabbing you with a plastic knife. My wife was not impressed. I was just like, oh, I get it. Things like that. And so it's just like, yeah, we are completely focused on us, right? And we would never have children because it would screw up our weed smoking and watching movies naked on a Saturday morning, which is what we really, really want to do. There's no sense of like, wanting to go outside of yourself and do things that don't please you. Sorry, does that answer your question? Okay. Anyway, like I said, I don't like him. His movies are bad too, which I've never watched them, but I could just assume that they are. Okay. How does this connect to sexuality? It's really interesting. All right. So, along with this, because timing is weird, one of my favorite social scientists, a political scientist named Ryan Burge, and if you took Social Religion with me, you'll be like, oh God, this guy again. He makes charts on Twitter. It's amazing. He's one of my favorite people. Has been publishing about trends in sex, right? And he did a big post on his Substack about it. His Substack, by the way, is called Graphs About Religion. It's amazing. You should all subscribe and give him money. It's not a paid promotion. I just love Ryan so much. And he's given me so much material to talk about religion with. Okay, and you'll see him again. We talk about religion and spirituality amongst young people. Okay, so he posted this article in his Substack, and he kind of commented on it from the LA Times. And again, has a bunch of statistics about kind of changing patterns of sexuality basically in the kind of youngest cohort. And I'll show you change over time in a second, so how this kind of differs, because we have lots of interesting information. So what we see here, right, is that if we look at the number of sexual partners that people had, one of the things we've seen, and this is in your 18 to 30 cohort, so this is our emerging adult cohort, people would be going to college and kind of breaking out on their own. We got a big chunk, right, a third of women and almost half, I guess like 43%, almost half of men, a little bit less, who have had 0 sexual partners in the last 12 months. So in the last year, people who had 0 sexual partners. And we can see, if we look at the trend over time, starting in 2011, that this number, 0 partners, was about 20%, and it has been kind of rising as a percentage of the population. And even, again, you can take this moralistically or not, whatever way you want. This kind of number of people who have like 1 sexual partner has grown a little, it's kind of gone up and down. It's been sort of a little bit of a yo-yo. It's stayed somewhat steady. And then the percentage with 2 or more partners has gone, if you look at 2011, right, you're talking better than 20% had 2 or more sexual partners in the last 12 months. And 2021, right, we're down in the 10s, right? We're down in just above, basically if you combine men and women, you're gonna be in the kind of 9 to 10% range. So less young people are having less sex. That's just California. Okay, this is Ryan Burge, right? Oh, did I cut off his, it's on the bottom here. At Ryan Burge on Twitter or X. 100% follow him. Really interesting, really like data-oriented brain, and he just like goes through existing data sets and just runs things through and then makes graphs and publishes papers, and he's awesome. My boss was joking around that people who just publish on existing data sets, their publication should not be counted as equal when they go for promotion. I just about threw a shoe at her. I was like, stop it. They're amazing. Just because you do original research doesn't mean everyone has to. People find really cool shit in existing research. Okay, so over time, trends over time, right? What do we see? So we've got 2 birth cohorts on this one, right? This birth cohort born 1989 to 1993. This is the time period, 1989 to 1993. And this is the time period, sorry, it's not birth cohorts, it's time periods, 2016 to 2022. In the general social survey data, where they're asking, people, what crazy stuff they ask on the GSS. Love it. Have you had sex at least once in the last year? Okay, so what we see, right, is this is our most recent generational cohort for people who are married, right? So we got probably not a lot of people here, but it used to be, right, if you were married in this, in 1989, 1993, basically in your 20s, 100% of people were having sex at least once a year, and that actually has dropped down considerably. I mean, it's not like massive, but it had dropped down a little bit. And we see all along the board, right, all the way from age 20 all the way to age 60, that in 2016, 2022, people are having less sex. In the not marrieds, right, the gap is sort of more significant. It crosses over here, right? Right about 40, apparently, married people stop having sex, more or less. That's good to know. And then they're having less sex than non-married people. But in general, in our kind of emerging adult cohort, compared to the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s, young people, all the way basically up to 40, are having less sex than older cohorts did. So there's definitely been some kind of change. And I want to go back to this because I think this is really interesting. And I had this quote. So this is a quote out of this LA Times article from a young woman. I can't remember her name. I think it's Jillian Rhodes, who, and as the story kind of lays it out, in high school, she never developed romantic feelings for anyone. She was assuming that someday she would have sex, but it just kind of never happened. And then sometime in her early 20s, someone basically said that they were, asexual. They didn't have any romantic feelings towards anyone. And she sort of, this resonated with her, and she went with that. And she's decided that she as well is asexual. And I just think that the quote is really, really interesting, right? It's really, I find it really intriguing. I'm glad people have fun with it being sex. And it works for them, but I think sex is kind of gross. It's, oh, you never thought you'd hear this in a class. Okay, it seems very messy. And it's vulnerable in a way I think would be very uncomfortable, right? Okay, so this is just from this year. So this is pretty much like prime Gen, like very, very young, very, very old Gen Zer. If she's 28 in 2024, she's very kind of on the older end of Gen Z. And so it's an interesting attitude. It's one that, especially with the rethinking of gender norms, has become much more sayable, which I think is really interesting too. I'm sure that people in the past also thought that sex was kind of gross and messy and vulnerable, but I don't think people articulated it in the same way. So some of this kind of idea system that's come in with all the questions around the gender spectrum have definitely made this kind of sayable, right? It made it that people could be like, yeah, I'm just not that interested in having sex, kind of ever. Now, what I do think is interesting, sorry, my brain is all over the place today, and I apologize, is this really closely parallels things that I was reading about Japan like 10 years ago, right? So like 10 years ago, I think honestly, I was doing this same class in the spring, and we were talking about this same kind of question. And I had been reading about Japan, and this became, in a sense, especially among young Japanese women, a really, really common way of thinking about sex, that it was gross and it was messy. And so I don't know what it is. Like, honestly, my brain is all like, as I was trying to put this together yesterday, my brain was like, I don't exactly know what's going on, right? But something does seem to be happening, right? We saw this happen, first in Japan. We've seen this kind of thing happen in Korea. And what we've seen in both of those societies too is fertility rates really dropping, right? Fertility rates dropping through the floor. Japan just hit 0.77, total fertility rate, or children per woman in the fertile range, which is like, if you continue at that rate by 2100, there'll be half as many people in Japan as there are today, right? Like, absolutely crazy. I don't understand. I don't even know how to put it into words, but it's all related kind of sexuality. And people really adopted this kind of thinking, young people especially, that sex is gross and they want nothing to do with it, especially young women. Okay. So Ryan finishes his piece with these two paragraphs. which I think are really interesting. So I like this. I'm gonna highlight it again. Why are folks? By the way, I hate the word folks, but I will forgive Ryan because he's great. But generally speaking, when people use the word folks, I don't know what they're doing. I just hate the word. I think it's meant to sound like more easily connectable, but I hate it. Like people, individuals. Let's not go with folks. I hate it. Okay, I mean, I don't think it takes too much imagination to conjure up the most likely suspect: smartphones. So, I mean, the rest of the class, in some senses, maybe with the exception of crime, is all about smartphones in some way. So, we're going to come back to the topic of smartphones and tech, especially when we look at Twenge's book, Jonathan's, new book that hopefully I can read in time. But yeah, really interesting, right? Oh, I love this. It's so honest. I think we can admit that sexual behavior is somewhat related to boredom. Yes. Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's worth saying that the last time the NHL was on lockout, there was a mini baby boom in Canada. So yeah, that might actually be it. When you have something to entertain yourself, then sex may not be on the top of mind. Or may not be top of mind. I think that's a really interesting kind of insight, right? And something that definitely we should think about because, and this is something that Twenge talks about in her book, the opportunity to have sex and to have sex with a variety of sexual partners it's unparalleled today. We'll talk about Mark Regnerus's book, Cheap Sex, because it's interesting. And yet more and more young people, and actually people overall, the whole population, seems to be foregoing having sex, maybe because it's easier to do other things. We'll talk about pornography in a minute, because I think pornography plays a role as well. Okay, maybe not in a minute. We're 25 minutes in, and I've said absolutely nothing other than sort of framing this. Okay, and this one, and sorry, this tickles my heartstrings, because I've always loved Postman. And anytime people bring in Postman, it always, makes my heart go a Twitter. So Ryan says that he's reminded of Neil Postman's masterpiece, Amusing Ourselves to Death. Really, really interesting book. It's about television, and it's about, I always say this is the book that fundamentally predicts Donald Trump as president, 40 years before it happened. Or 35 years before it happened, because it basically says we've turned everything into entertainment, and what is Trump if not an entertainer? But Postman starts out that book with a very simple kind of thesis, and he compares Orwell's Brave New World, this dystopian future where essentially in Postman's framing, we're controlled by the things we hate, right? We're controlled by the state and a super powerful state. And he contrasts this to another dystopian book, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. If you've never read Brave New World, it's like $2 on Kindle. You can always find it super cheap. It's an amazing book, right? Absolutely amazing book. And what Huxley sort of predicts, in a way, is that the things that we love are the things that will actually enslave us. And it's seen something of a renaissance in the last few years because, as people get more and more, I don't want to say addicted because I hate the pathological language, but as smartphones and other devices take up more and more of our time, one of the things that Huxley and kind of post-Huxleyians have said is that our addiction to amusement is what will lead to the decline of civilization. For some, farming clicks and shares on social media gives us a dopamine hit that supplants feelings derived from sexual contact. So, increasingly, right, let's say, we've got our adage, oops, that's ugly, but we'll keep going with it. We had our little thing of Netflix and chill, which meant, invite someone over to watch Netflix, but really you want to have sex with them. And increasingly, you can just leave the chilling part out, and all you're going to do is watch Netflix or play video games of some kind. Yeah, please.
So how does it relate to the fact that
Oops, sorry.
hookup culture is something that is getting
Okay, it's a really interesting question. I do have stuff on hookup culture coming up. Well, one of the things that, and this is something that Twenge talks about in her book, Generations, is that yes, hookup culture is increasingly the norm for young people, but what we see increasingly is more people kind of opting out of having sex at all, right? So if we go back here, you have like honestly, and we talk about, well, I'll talk about hookup culture. We'll talk about like hookup apps, right? Because they've proliferated as well. In theory, you have thousands, tens of thousands of potential sexual partners at your fingertips. That's a little harder if you're male, because not everyone wants to sleep with you. If you're female, it's much easier to find a sexual partner because men, well, to be honest, will probably have sex with just about anything, or anyone, at anything. I'm going to go with anything, actually, because I can think of a few less than savory examples. And yet, with this, what we're seeing is the growth of this, right? In that cohort that should be using those hookup apps increasingly. So hookup culture as a kind of mode of entering relationships is increasingly common, and we'll talk about that. And it's more and more the script that young people have to explain how do you get into a relationship, how do you have sex, and yet fewer and fewer of them are doing it, right? And again, like if we see from starting from here, you maybe would have had like 2011, the beginnings of hookup culture. And that sort of is, the high point for people having one or more sexual partners in a year, after which point zero grows, pretty considerably, right? And I suspect that, to almost, let's say almost 40 odd percent, it's probably a little bit lower only because women tended to have, one sexual partner more often than men did. By the way, this is your incels, right? If we want to talk about social trends, that whole phenomenon is coming here of these people who are, some of them may not want to have sex, some of them might want to, but they're not for whatever reason. So people are they're opting out for some reason. And I mean, one would suspect that given that, these two numbers aren't equal, that probably some of these women are dating older people too. But anyway, that's a speculation. I don't know. Now I'm just doodling on my own slide for no reason. Did I kind of answer your question? Okay. We will talk about hookup culture. Like I said, I'm a little bit less than, that's not that I'm not organized. I know what I'm talking about. I'm just like, this is like a tickle brain for me. It's like, I've been thinking kind of about this for a long time. And all of a sudden it's like burst into popular imagination in the social sciences where other people are like freaking out about it. And I'm like, yes, I've been thinking about this for like a really, really long time. And suddenly other people are like, wait, this is a problem. And it's like, uh-oh. Or this is a phenomenon. Maybe it's not a problem. Who knows? Okay. And I apologize. These are not great slides charts because they cut off. I was trying to find graphical representations for it. But I couldn't find anything that went past basically 2010 because apparently that's when people stopped making charts about this. But, what we see in terms of relationships. What's really interesting, I was looking at kind of the stats, and they asked, young people whether they think marriage is outdated. This was a study from 2021. And it was still, a minority that said that marriage was completely outdated. And this is all over the place. This is backed up in a couple books by Mark Regnerus, both in Cheap Sex and in a book called The Future of Christian Marriage, where he says, like, people still view marriage as a useful institution. It's just being pushed off later and later. And so, I mean, if we look at, Canada, if we look at the actual numbers, right, these numbers have both continued to go up and will continue to go up. Now, I think it's about 32 for men. And for women, it is sitting at a little like 28, 29 in terms of age of first marriage. So in terms of marriage, right, people are still interested, but it's coming much, much later, right? There's, for those who do get married, it's coming much, much later. Now, that said, the total number of people that get married, in terms of, this is in the US, marriage and divorce rate per 1,000, right? Marriage kind of peaked over here, right around that's right in the Second World War. Lots of people got married before they shipped off to war. Hey, I mean, if you're going off to die in Europe, maybe get lucky once. I don't know, to put it crudely. But, it kind of peters off after the wars. And then, it was probably about as low as it is today during the Great Depression, when people were just not in a position to get married economically. And we're kind of back around there, today in the US. And Canada looks very similar. So marriage, the number of marriages per 1,000 people today in the US sits at about 6, right? Or about 7. I guess it's about 7 if I look at it. During the Depression, it was a little bit under 8. 1860, it was about 10, and then it was like, almost 20, right at the time of the Second World War. So we've seen a big decline in how many people get married as well. So not only are people getting married later, fewer people are getting married at all. Okay, this was a weird and kind of fun visual way to organize this. This is the age at first marriage by state. So, and the pink is men, the red is women. And I mean, you can see some patterns, right? Kind of middle America here. It's a little bit younger. Colorado. So some of the more liberal states, California is a little bit older. Oregon, Washington, Oregon. If you look at the Northwest, kind of the richest part of the country, right? So, around here, it's all fairly late, trending towards the 30s. Florida, for all the talk of it being a very conservative place, this is red, and you cannot see at all what I'm circling. That is excellent work by me. Awesome job, Broussard. All right, let's go with blue or green, maybe green. Right, so here, right up here. That's much more visible. Right, those are the Northwest states. It's also the richest part of the country, right? So people get married a lot younger in the richest part of the country. But even like in your Midwest states, right, or your prairie states, Montana, it's a little bit younger. North Dakota, South Dakota. Are you impressed with my knowledge of American geography? Idaho, right, potato land. It's quite a bit younger in Idaho. Now the downside is there's 6 people that live there, so there's that. Wyoming too, right? A little bit younger. I love Wyoming. My favorite thing to know about Wyoming is that Wyoming has a population of 580,000. So Wyoming's entire population is about half the city of Edmonton. And we drove through Wyoming this summer. Super duper empty place. Now I can't remember which state this is because this is where my American geography breaks down. Right, you've got a couple of Midwestern states. What's south of South Dakota? I don't remember. Right, but then you've got kind of in the middle of the country, which is, by the way, some of the poorer parts of the country, a little bit earlier marriage. So, and then this one, which I know what this is because I know that little stick. Sorry? Older, yeah. The richer parts of the country, right, up in the Northeast here, this is all the richest parts of the country. It's all trending towards the 30s, right? The only places that are trending towards the mid-20s are these Midwestern states that are a little bit poorer, including this one with the stick. And I can't remember what it is, but I know it's really important. I can't remember. It's not important, actually. But is it Oklahoma? Okay, yes. If it's Oklahoma, it might be, right? So anyway, these are poor kind of Midwestern states. Like even in some of the states that we think of as kind of, the Mississippis, the Alabamas, and such, it's still a little bit older in here. So the trends aren't clear, but the poorest parts of the country do tend to have, younger ages of first marriage. I know that's Nevada. All right, Colorado. Anyway, I don't know. Now anyway. So I lost the plot of my lecture. Generally, right, richer parts of the U.S. marry a little bit later. They're all trending towards that older age. It's also like, if you talk about, California and then the Northeast, that's where the bulk of the U.S. population lives as well, right? So the bulk of the U.S. population is getting married considerably later. And yeah, like Texas, California, Florida, and New York, which is like here somewhere, all getting married considerably later. Okay. And not surprisingly, the effect that this has had on TFR, or total fertility rate, is pretty understandable, right? You don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure it out. But, if we go back to, 1920s. The total fertility rate was about 3.5. Kind of peaks around, what we talked about, 1958, more or less. This is Canada. And then it declines from there. This line is replacement fertility. So we've been below replacement fertility since about 1972. So I'm a great doodler. Total fertility has essentially crashed in Canada, and all of these relationship things are related to it. Later age of first marriage, obviously birth control, all of these things play a role in declining fertility. If people are getting married more towards their 30th birthday, it's just many fewer years to I think about taking your fertility window, and if you were back here, right? If you were back in 1951 and you were getting married at 18, 19, right? And roughly, you're going to have more and more trouble conceiving by the time you get to about 44, you're done. At 18, 19, you have a solid 20-year window to have children, so you can have more of them. If you move that forward by 10 years, right, or 10, 12 years, and you start getting married at 30, you've got maybe, a 12 to 14-year window. But in that part of the window, it's much harder to get pregnant. So you will just tend naturally to have fewer and fewer children. And again, we saw this same trend, say in places like Japan and South Korea, where the age of first marriage got later and later, especially for women. And then, TFR crashed. Okay. Same kind of story for the US, right? And it ends at 2020, so that's good. Right, you got your peak in the 1950s, after which it declines. About 2.1 is about here. So the US has kind of popped above 2.1 a couple of times, but as of 2020, it was really low, right? And I think the US was sitting about 1.7. Canada today, by the way, is sitting at 1.33. And every year it trends down. We're heading in South Korean direction very, very quickly. So all that related to sex. Okay. Hopefully this will all make sense. Okay. So when we talk about, who has sex, there are some kind of relatively discernible patterns in the teen years. So, teens tend to find out about sexual matters from their peers, school, or I'm going to put it here, porn. Increasingly, porn is our number one sexual educator, unfortunately. We'll talk about why that might be a problem, probably next class. I have some fun stories about times I've lectured about pornography and had people walk in randomly, and it's always super fun. And I'll tell you next class. Okay, later sexual activity tends to be related to higher socioeconomic class. So we see certain patterns, right? Because people will typically start having sex somewhere between around 13 to about 22 at the kind of, that's the kind of normal range. The people who are at the 13, 15 tend more typically to be from the kind of poor socioeconomic strata, right? Again, it's not 100% of the time. There's nothing that's 100%, but it tends to be that the richer you are, the later you will have sex for the first time, right? There's typically more parental supervision, less time left alone, all of those things, less divorce and all that stuff. Religion plays a role, but maybe not in the way that you think. So basically we see Muslims and Hindus tend to have their first sexual experiences considerably later than Christian, Jews, or nuns. So, being a Muslim or Hindu, and again, you're probably looking here at a sort of first generation immigrant or second generation immigrant sort of effect, right? Where those families are a little bit more conservative, probably a lot more protective of their female offspring, and so they're more protected that way. Yeah, please. A Moog. Aha.
So if there were being from like the higher socioeconomic class, wouldn't they have more leisure time? So wouldn't that mean they have more of an opportunity for sexual activity?
So interestingly, incorrect, but it's an interesting assumption. They will tend to have, especially in those teen years, much less unstructured time. And I'm going to say unstructured rather than leisure, right? Because they're going to be signed up for all sorts of activities, right? Mom and dad are going to be taking little Jimmy to hockey and coding camp. And, little Tina is in figure skating and violin and volleyball. Little Tina ain't got no time for sex because little Tina's time is massively overscheduled, partially because her parents can afford it, right? They can afford to keep their kids in a lot of activities. There's also, more typically, two parents. Okay, my pen is broken down on me again. These slides are too colorful. All right, try that again. Two parents, right? So there's two parents more typically, right? So divorce also has kind of socioeconomic trends. The kind of more you are towards the working class, the more likely you are to get divorced. Pretty strong statistics. You're also more likely to have gotten married. There's too many things in my brain. You're likely to have gotten married a little bit earlier, right? Probably a slightly higher chance that you got married as a result of an accidental pregnancy. So divorce rates tend to trend higher for working class and poor. And then no marriage, right? Single motherhood rate is way higher. Now, what two parents does as well, you can typically afford more things like activities, so more structured time, and it's more likely that there's someone at home, right? If you have a single parent, more likely that, did I have this here? Yes, sorry, I have it. You got me onto my next point. Family structure, right? Divorced parents children tend to have first sexual experiences earlier. Same thing with single parents, right? Because they have more unstructured time where, maybe they start dating someone in junior high or high school, and then they invite that person home after school because mom's not home or dad's not home. There's no one home, they're alone. And then what do two teenagers do? They experiment and have sex, right? So yeah, in this case, actually, your instinct is somewhat correct. They should have more leisure time. They don't have to work and stuff, but they tend to be scheduled in all sorts of things, right? And right up until really graduation from high school, they tend to be really, really overscheduled. Okay, good. Hookup culture. Oh, do I have time for my friend Donna? How long are you? 7 minutes. I really want you to hear. Well, maybe I'll introduce Donna, and we'll start Monday's class with watching her talk about hookup culture because she has a really interesting kind of take. Now, this research is a little bit, it's getting a little bit long in the tooth now. The newest edition of it was 2015, but I think still kind of the definitive work on hookup culture, right? And the first edition of it was in 2008. She updated it. And then she had written another book called The End of Sex in 2013. Donna's a really interesting character. I really like Donna. She's done some truly fascinating work, especially in the kind of, how to put this? The interaction between religious faith and sex, right? That's why the book is called Sex and the Soul, because it talks about, how different sorts of religious upbringings and religious beliefs play a role in, how people evolve into their sexuality. And to do this, essentially, she surveyed students, 1,230 students from 4 different colleges, and conducted, interviews with about 70 of them, and also had a bunch of them write online journals, which ended up generating most of the interesting kind of content. Okay. So, evangelicals were weird. People who went to evangelical schools were completely different. But the other 3, so we'll cross them out. We won't talk about them because their whole culture is really, really different. We can talk about it if you want one-on-one. But at Catholic colleges, non-religious public colleges, and non-religious private colleges, what she basically found was that hookup culture was sort of the norm. Okay, and I can't spoil her video because she does a great job of explaining it, and I want you to see it. So we'll cut it off here. We'll pick it up on Monday. Hey, I made 12 slides. I feel like I did okay. We'll pick it up from here. We'll talk hookup culture. We'll talk about pornography. It'll be a blast. It should be really, really fun. Or not. I don't know. Maybe you're like, this is the most awkward thing I've ever had to be lectured on. I think it's really interesting. So we'll pick it up on Monday. Have a great weekend, everyone.